Good morning and welcome to this webinar brought to you by NQA. My name is Richard Walsh. I'm NQA's Principal Assessor for Energy and Environment. So I'd like to welcome you. I noticed from the attendee list there's one or two people that our paths have crossed over the years. So I'll say hello to anybody that I might have met previously. And hopefully, if you've not met me before, or maybe you've only come across me in a webinar, as I say, you're all very welcome. So just to make sure that you're attending the webinar that you think you're attending, so as you see on the slide, hopefully everybody can see the screen. We're going to be looking at, for the next hour or so, we're going to be going back to basics with ISO 14001. Just a very quick, I sort of joke, I'm contractually obliged to show all of these marketing slides. So this is just a little bit about who NQA are. If you haven't come across us previously, I think probably most of you have by now. So that's who we are, with a number of bases around the globe. Predominantly the two main ones being in London and a site in the States for NQA USA, and a little bit about on the slide there about the types of certification we do and where we sit in the sort of hierarchy of assessors, of assessment bodies. We specialise obviously in management system certification, and we cover everything that you see on there. And now obviously this time we're going to be concentrating on environment. Towards the end we might just have a little bit of a link about energy, and particularly into carbon neutrality as well, because that's an area that we're starting to see a lot of interest. And again, just a quick list there of some of the key clients, some of the household names that you may come across. Those are companies that we currently work with. If you've not met me before, that's me. I predominantly audit to environment and energy, and also now I'm a lead carbon verifier as well. And part of my role is picking up a lot of our significant clients, perhaps more challenging clients, but also then bringing on and developing the skills of other NQA staff and assessors, making sure that they're up to speed on technical knowledge. So as you see on the left-hand side of there, I'm going to be speaking for about 45 minutes. There will be an opportunity for questions. Now, I don't know why it says chat box, actually. I didn't put this slide together. You should have on your screen, you should have a box that allows you to type in either questions or indeed chat. Could I ask, and I will change this slide for the next presentation I deliver, if you've got any questions, can you type the questions in the question box rather than the chat box? If the question is pertinent to be answered at the time, then I'll pick it up there and then. If not, we'll come back to the questions towards the end. So one of the things that we've found, I found particularly, I think, with 14001, it's obviously a standard that's been around an awful long time. The very first version of the standard was published in 1996. There was then a version in 2004, and the current version, which I still sometimes call the new version, was produced in 2015. That's 7 years ago. One of the things I find that in some respects people are losing their way a little bit, and what I wanted to do was to go back almost to what is the intention of 14001. Why was it written? What's it there to manage? And how can you, as I guess those people who implement and are managing systems certified to 14001, how can you use that standard to make the best of improving your business's impact on the environment, because that's what it's there for. So we're going to have a look at right the way back to the basics. So the key overarching concepts of 14001. So what's it there for? Why would a business want to implement ISO 14001? A reminder of the structure of the standard. We're going to have another look. The main part of this will be a look at the clauses. So we'll go through it all clause by clause, and we'll have a little bit of a look at. Oh, so Michael's asking, can anyone else hear anything? Sound keeps jumping out. Can somebody else just in the question box, if anybody else is having a problem with sound, can you let me know? Or if this, right, thank you, Claire. Yeah, that's right, that's fine. We've got more than enough there. I think, Michael, it's yourself that's got the issue rather than at this end, because I've now had about 7 or 8 people all say it's fine for them. So sorry about that, Michael. But yes, if you whether you want to just drop out and come back in and see if that solves the problem, I'm not so sure. Okay, we'll push on. So we're going to have a fresh look at the clauses of the standard, and that will be the main part of what we do. What's required, and I suppose in a way importantly, what we as assessors, not just me, but any of our other staff that are coming in, and indeed, even if you're not certified by NQA, this is really what the assessors should be looking for. And then a little bit of a discussion and maybe a little bit of a chat at the end about 14001. Is it a destination, or is it a stepping stone onto something else? And what might that something else be or look like? So all of the standards, all of these, what we call the new standards, so 14,001 2015, 9,001 2015, 45,001 2018, and 50,001, which is the energy standard 2018, all have it's like a concept, something that they're setting out to achieve. And the aim of the standard is to provide organisations with a framework that enables them to protect the environment and also then to respond to changing environmental conditions. We live in a world where you've only got to turn the news on, and if we can get away from prime ministerial resignations, etc., usually the second most popular thing is around the environment, and either people protesting because they feel that we're not doing sufficient, or people talking about the impact that climate is having on various parts of the world. So what the standard is asking us to do is to take a systematic approach to protect the environment by preventing or mitigating adverse environmental impacts, to help us as a business mitigate the potential adverse effect of environmental conditions that may be placed upon us. So yesterday I was down in Somerset, back home now in West Yorkshire, but yesterday I was in Somerset at the end of a 2-day audit with a company that provides potatoes. They buy potatoes from farmers, package them and sell them to the main supermarkets. They have had to adapt quite significantly to the type of climate conditions that they're finding. It's at the moment, if you speak to farmers, it's either too wet or too dry. It's never quite right. And they've been working with their farmers through the 14,001 system. They've been working with the farmers through their suppliers to look at how they can increase yield, how they can, are they planting the right varieties? This is all working using the standard to help mitigate potential adverse effects. It will help in fulfilling compliance obligations. Now, obviously, the older standards used to call them legal and other requirements. There are compliance obligations from legislation. There may be agreements with people that live nearby, and Mrs. Smith across the road that doesn't want to have her washing dirtied through emissions, whatever it might be. There are people who have a legitimate interest in any business, and it's assisting with the fulfilment of the compliance obligations, be they legal or what we would term voluntary obligations. Enhancing the business's environmental performance, that's the main thing, really. That's the main underlying aim of the standard. to help a business enhance its environmental performance, which includes all of the other things that come above that. And ultimately, controlling or influencing the way organisations' products, should be an apostrophe there, I apologise, the way the organisation's products and services are designed, manufactured, distributed, consumed, and ultimately disposed of. So there is also, in this latest version of the standard, there is a requirement to consider the life cycle approach to the product or the service that you are offering. So the overarching concept. So 14001 has an intended outcome. You'll find all of this written at the beginning of the standard, not in the auditable clauses, and we'll look at what those are in a minute, but at the very beginning of the standard in what it calls clause 1, there are some intended outcomes. And the standard requires that businesses enhance their environmental performance, fulfill their compliance obligations, and achieve the environmental objectives that are set. A part of that is the management of change. So there's quite a section in there, clause 6, which is all about the planning process. And the planning process has been enhanced to make sure that things are thought about, if you like, before they happen, so that we try and anticipate what can go wrong. There's a section which you'll look at shortly on risks and opportunities. We'll see how that works in terms of management of change. Management of risk, and the standard defines risk as positive or negative. So we'll tend to talk about risks and opportunities, but it all comes under the heading risk. And also the standard, because they all follow this, what's called Annex SL. Annex SL is, I would describe it as an empty standard. It's a bit like a Christmas tree. Before you start hanging all the baubles on there, it's a structure. And all of the standards now, the ones I mentioned earlier, 9001, 50001, 45001, and so on, they all have the same structure, deliberately so that it makes them easier to be integrated. And I looking down the list, looking at the people that are attending, I see a few clients that I work with that have got fully integrated standards, where they've integrated quality, health and safety, environment, and in some cases, energy as well. Just so that we all understand where we're going and what we're talking about, the standard has a number of definitions which we need to think about. And also, we find sometimes as assessors that there's a little bit of misunderstanding about what this might mean. So where the standard uses the term consider, it means that it's necessary to think about the topic, think about whatever it is, but you can exclude it. If it uses the phrase take into account, again, it's necessary to think about that topic, but you cannot exclude it. Continual is improvement generally. So continual improvement is something that occurs over a period of time, and continuous is improvement, if you like, without interruption. The standard does not use anywhere the term continuous, and neither should you in any of your documentation. I see a number of people in their policy statements, particularly, where they talk about continuous improvement, and that is not the right term to use, because that is suggesting that you are continually improving. You're better today than you were yesterday. You're better this week than you were last week. The analogy I tend to use between continual and continuous: continual is a set of stairs where the direction is still upwards, but there may be periods of non-improvement, shall we say, maybe when you get to the landing and you're turning a corner and then you're setting off again on the next flight of stairs, whereas continuous would be a ramp and you are always on the upward flight. So those are just 4 definitions that I'd like you to be aware of. This is a slide that I put together many years ago now, and you'd be surprised how many people I've seen have pinched this slide, lifted this slide, and use it in their presentations. The standard follows the Deming cycle of Plan, Do, Check, Act. I don't know. I tend to look at things linear rather than in a circle. So what I've done here is I've lifted out the main clauses of the standard and the sub clauses and put them under the main headings: the plan, do, check, act, as you can see there. And the non-auditable clauses are clauses 1, 2, and 3: scope, normative references, and terms and definitions. That's how the standard is structured. And the areas that we're going to concentrate on today are the clauses 4 to 10. One of the interesting things that hit me a year or two ago now, if we were thinking about this as a flowchart, the even numbered clauses, and this, you may have heard me say this before, or you may have heard other people say this. This may be completely new, a new thing for you. The even numbered clauses, context, planning, operation, and improvement, are clauses where things happen. The odd clauses facilitate moving from clause 4 to clause 6, from clause 6 to clause 8, and clause 8 to clause 10. So if we just quickly follow that through, context is all about working out who we are, where do we sit, what's important to us, who's got an interest in what we do, what is the scope of our management system, and what's our management system going to look like. In order to move on to start thinking about planning and actually putting some of that into action, we need some leadership, we need some commitment, we need a policy, we need people to understand what it is they're doing, we need some roles, responsibilities, and authorities. Once we've planned what we're going to do, through risks and opportunity evaluation, aspects evaluation, setting of objectives, and some planning of changes, how do we move on to actually doing that? Well, we need some resource, we need some competent people, we need people to be aware of what it is they're expected of them, we need to communicate what we're doing, and we need to ensure that we've got the necessary documentation in place. We then have the operations, so we actually put things into operation, so we have operational control. However, that's not the end of it. We need to then check how we're doing. So clause 9 is all about checking, evaluating our performance. And once we've evaluated the performance, we can then start to set some improvement targets, some improvement objectives, and think about how we improve our system, how we improve our impact on the environment. So clauses 4, 6, 8, and 10 are things that we do, where we do things, and 5, 7, and 9 are the odd clauses that facilitate moving from clause 4 to 6, 6 to 8, and 8 to 10. Whether that's helpful or not, I don't know, but try and bear that model in mind as we go through this next part of the standard, where we're going to now look at all of the individual clauses. So clause 4, so this is the first of the auditable clauses, the first 3 are not, is context of the organisation. And basically what clause 4 is talking about is asking you as an organisation, what are the issues that we need to worry about or that we need to think about? It asks us to start to think within clause 4. So this is a summary of the whole of clause 4. It asks us to think about the interested parties. Who are they? What do they expect from us? It talks a little bit about scope, the scope of the system, and we can't use the scope to exclude things that might have a significant impact on the environment. So for instance, if we are working on a site and in one corner of the site we've got something, a really dirty process, we can't draw a line around that and say, you know what, we'll leave that out of scope. That's something that can't happen. The scope can't exclude things that have a significant environmental aspect or impact. And obviously the scope of the systems to be available as documented information. So the sub-clauses within clause 4, the context of the organisation. The way I best describe this in terms of coming back to basics, there are things out there in the wider world, and there are things within our own internal organisation. There are things that will help us achieve the intended outcome of the system. Remember, the intended outcome predominantly being improving our environmental performance. There are things that are going to help us, and there are things that are going to get in the way. There are things that are going to slow us down, cause problems, whatever. And it's about determining what those are. The things that are going to help us will then become the opportunities when we move on to clause 6. The things that are going to get in the way become the risks, and it's all about maximizing the opportunities and minimizing the risks. The next slide will put that into a little bit more of a visual picture. But it's all about considering where you sit as an organization and the needs of those interested parties, be they customers, be they neighbours, be they suppliers, be they the regulator, shareholders, staff, whoever. If we do that, if we work out the important things to us, both in terms of interested parties and the issues that can affect us, those two together should result in your EMS focusing on the issues that present the greatest risk. And as I said, the standard sees risk as a positive or a negative in working towards this environmental improvement. So this is a visual view, that's fine, of what I've just been talking about. So context is the bit that's at the start on the left-hand side. There are things that will help achieve the intended outcome and things that will get in the way. The things that will help become the opportunities in clause 6.1. The things that will get in the way become the risks. And this is a concept that if you get this bit right and think about using these clauses in this way, it will help you make sure that your EMS is focused on the things that really matter. This is a slide that was picked up from one of my initial presentations where people said to me, well, what sort of things should we think about? And there's many ways of doing it. The standard doesn't tell you how you have to do it, but a lot of people will look at maybe 3 things: environmental conditions, climate change, air quality, water quality, land use, and so on. External issues, the legal regulatory framework, what's the current economic framework, the technology that's available to us, social and cultural issues in maybe the area that we work or the sector that we're in, what are our competition doing, etc., etc. And then internally, what's the strategic direction of the business? What capabilities do we currently have? What's our compliance status in terms of legislation, permits that we might be working under, etc., etc.? What's the culture of the business? What other standards have we have? Have we got 9,001? Have we got 45,001? How will those help us in terms of steering our environmental issues in the right direction? The intent of all of this is ultimately to provide a high-level understanding of those important issues that can positively or negatively affect the way in which our environmental responsibilities are managed. Once we're aware of what they are and we've documented and detailed them in clause 6, which we'll come on to, we are then making sure that we are picking up the right issues, we're picking up those significant issues, and we're not wasting time, money and energy on things that are maybe not the most important issues. Within clause 4.2 is this section on interested parties, understanding the needs and expectations of those parties, determining what the relevant requirements are, determining which ones we can ignore, and the standard does allow you to do that. Obviously, you can't ignore legal requirements, they have to be included. And one of the things we say is that voluntary arrangements become obligations when agreed and adopted. So you might have a voluntary agreement. One of my clients that I still work with have an agreement with some residents. In order to get to their site, they have to drive past a number of houses. They have a voluntary agreement with those houses that they won't have vehicle movements after a certain time at night or before 7 o'clock in the morning, or other than under exceptional circumstances. That is a local agreement, but it has become an obligation, and it actually sits in their register of compliance obligations. That's something that they have to agree to and check. Are we doing what we said we would, what we promised? So the scope of the EMS itself. So the standard requires that we define the scope. Now, again, there's a little bit of confusion sometimes here. The wording that you will see on your certificate, be it an NQA certificate or one of the other certification bodies, or I'm not going to mention, the scope of the EMS on the certificate is what's called the scope of registration. and that is a fairly short, usually, snapshot of what it is the business does, so that if somebody looks at your certificate, they have a good idea what it is you actually do. Within the system itself, you are expected to have a slightly broader statement that gives a little bit more detail about what it is you actually do, which bits of the business are covered, because you can include part of the organization. You don't have to do every single bit of the organization. However, you cannot use the scope to exclude significant aspects or to evade compliance obligations. The scope mustn't be misleading. So, for example, I have a couple of clients that are predominantly office-based, and the scope of the system is only the facilities management of the activities of the office. They can't claim to have 14,001 for the whole organisation because it's only covering the facilities management. But to be fair to them, that's where their most significant aspects are, and the work that goes on in the office doesn't have a particularly high environmental impact. But the documented scope must be made available to interested parties. And the final bit of this clause is to establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve the management system to achieve the intended outcomes. So we know what the intended outcomes are, and there is a requirement that not only are you improving your business's impact on the environment, but you're also improving the system itself. I just noticed Anthony Mason has put a link in the chat bar in the questions, a link to iso.org, and it's ISO name and logo.html. I'm not quite sure why that's there, Anthony. A quick question from Janet. I will pick this one up now. If you're going for an IMS, does the scope needs to be consistent? Generally, yes, but there may be some subtle differences. So I do have clients with all three standards, 9, 14 and 45. In terms of the sites that they cover, they all cover the same sites. However, the wording in the scope is slightly different, simply because if you think about 9001, 9001 is a little bit more descriptive of the actual product or service that you are delivering or producing, whereas health and safety and environment is slightly less related to the actual product itself and is a little bit more around the, if you like, the indirect outputs, inputs and outputs. So you might have a slightly different wording, but I think it would be very difficult to have a completely different scope. But again, if you have concerns about that, then either feel free to chat to me later on or chat to your assessor. They'll be able to help you with that. But ultimately, what we're expecting on the management system itself is to integrate the system into the business processes. The days of having, well, this is what we do as a business, and then we've got Fred at the end of the corridor who looks after the AMS. We don't know what he does, but he keeps us out of jail. Those days are long gone. We expect to see the management system fully integrated into the business processes. Remember now the odd and even numbered clauses to move us from where we've just come from in identifying the key issues into start to do some action. We need some leadership. I will give you a bit of a warning. We are seriously overrunning, and that's my fault because I tend to talk a lot. So we certainly will be going on to 12 o'clock in terms of the presentation, but I'll just give you a little bit of a warning about that. So leadership, very important. We need to make sure that the EMS isn't managed in isolation, and it's all about the senior leaders on the site, be it the managing director, be it the whatever you want to call the person or the group of people at the highest level within the organisation. Make sure that it's not managed in isolation. It's not managed separately from the core strategy of the business. The strategy of the business should include the environmental and indeed quality and health and safety if you've got an integrated management system. They should all be pulling in the same direction. The EMS should be considered when strategic business decisions are made. I've had a number of occasions over the years where I've gone back into a site and say, oh, I see you've got a new building. and the EMS manager will go, yeah, by the time I found out about it, it was too late. They'd already planned everything. And you walk around and you think, well, actually, you could have done a little bit better. You could have looked at a better type of lighting, heating, whatever. So any strategic decisions that are made within the business should be run through or have an involvement of the environmental management system. The EMS needs to be aligned with business objectives. So quite often now we see the business objectives taking. Sometimes the business objectives involve some of the environmental objectives and targets, so things like reduction in energy use, moving to a more sustainable type of supply. Some of those all go hand in hand. Obviously, we need to make sure that the system itself benefits from the appropriate level of resources. That's actually clause 7, but I bring it in here because it's normally the leaders that would provide the resources. Receives the appropriate involvement from across the business. It can't just be one person's job. It does need to provide real value to the organisation. It's not just a box with a load of columns that you would tick. It's not just a flag on the wall or a badge. An EMS needs to provide real value to the business and provide a driving force, if you like, provide a central core around which all of the different sustainability issues within the business can be managed. But ultimately, it needs to continually improve and remain successful, a successful EMS in the long term. And if all of these different issues are taken into account and the system is used in the way that it's meant to be, it shouldn't be a millstone around your neck. It should provide a real improvement. So top management is defined as the person or group of people who direct and control an organisation at the highest level. I'm not going to read out everything that's in there. I'll just come back to that in a second, Anthony. One of the things I should have said right at the start, everybody who's signed up to this webinar will receive copies of the slides. So you don't need to frantically write it down. And also we record all of our webinars, so you will be able to, if you want to listen again. It says you included the ISO logo on one of your slides, and strictly speaking, only ISO members can use it. I disagree. I'm not using it to promote. Well, I'm just using it to show that it's there. I'm not making any claim about it. As far as I'm aware, there is no issue with me actually using that ISL logo as a piece of information on a slide. I would agree if I was using it alongside a certificate of registration or something like that. But I think at the end of the day, promoting ISO's standards, which is what I'm trying to do here, fits in with the ethos of the use of the ISO logo. Happy to talk to you outside of that, Anthony, but as far as I'm concerned, nobody's ever picked me up on that before. Our regulatory team approve all of our slides, and I think I'm using it in a way that ISO would actually approve of, because as I say, I'm promoting use of their standards. We'll draw a line under that one and we'll move on. Okay, so the policy itself, the standard requires that you have a policy, if you like. That's the flag under which we sail. It sets the objectives, sets the targets for what we do, sets the aims and of the system. The standard needs to be appropriate to the purpose of the organisation. You can't just pinch somebody else's policy. It needs to provide a framework for setting objectives. It needs to be documented and communicated. And there are 4 basic commitments. Whilst I'm quite happy to say that I don't view our assessments as a tick box, there are times when I'm looking for a number of things within a document. And in a way, this is a tick box. The standard has to make 4 commitments. You'll be surprised to hear that I still find in fairly mature systems that sometimes all of these commitments are missing. Usually the one about continual improving the EMS to enhance environmental performance. That is a commitment that needs to be within the policy document. And as I say, it surprises me sometimes that those 4 things, the wording doesn't have to be exactly as that, but certainly they have to, the intention for all of those 4 commitments has to be there. Now, there is a policy commitment that talks about protection of the environment, and the protection of the environment includes prevention of pollution and prevention of other things that might be specific to the aspect itself. And this can include sustainable resource use, climate change mitigation, adaptation, protection of biodiversity, ecosystems, etc., etc. One of the things that, and I'm not going into massive detail here, but one of the slight issues with 50,001 is 50,001 only looks at the amount of energy that's being used, doesn't look at where that energy has come from. And there's a little bit of tension at the moment between the requirements of 14,001, which would encourage businesses to look at alternative sources of energy. Can you put solar PV on the roof? Can you use wind turbines? Can you use biomass? Whatever. Whereas 50,001 that talks about reducing the amount of energy that you use, and even goes as far as to say that the implementation of renewable generation on site isn't classified as an energy performance improvement. That's another issue that we can pick up at some other time if need be. We need to set roles and responsibilities. They need to be set, assigned and communicated within the organisation, making sure that everybody is fully aware of what's expected of them. So clause 6, the planning clause, this one of the changes in this current standard is it's become a lot more proactive than reactive. So the planning clauses have been massively enhanced, and this goes across all of these newish standards. So it's all about planning to address the issues that we identified in clause 4. So think back to the even numbered clauses. We've identified what the issues are. We've set out that we've got some leadership, we've got the resources in place, etc., etc. We've got a policy that sets the direction we're going to move in. We now need to start to think about how are we going to deal with those issues to make sure that we achieve our intended outcomes and that we prevent or reduce undesired effects. And it's all about the planning clauses achieving continual improvement in our environmental performance. So clause 6.1.1 is all about prioritising the issues with potential adverse or beneficial effects. We need to think about what our significant aspects are, what is it we're doing that has a significant impact on the environment. We need to think about our compliance obligations. We need to think about other issues that might have adverse or beneficial effects on our organisation. Think back to 4.1 and 4.2, and then we need to start to prioritise them. And the prioritising has to be based on, are they going to achieve or help us achieve our intended outcome? Are they going to help us prevent adverse effects or mitigate those adverse effects? And ultimately, are they going to help us achieve continual improvement? So environmental aspects are the things that have a material impact on the environment itself. What we put up the chimney, what we put down the drain, what we put in the skip, the resources that we use, etc., etc. So the standard says that we have to think about environmental aspects of our activities, products and services that we can control or influence. That's important, and their associated environmental impacts. So the standard says we have to take into account change, new or modified activities, products and services, planned or new developments. Remember, take into account means we have to think about it and we can't exclude it. So we have to make sure that our aspect register is continually being modified, updated to reflect the changes in our business. We need to think about abnormal, so things that don't normally happen, and also reasonably foreseeable emergency situations. The aspect register should cover adverse and also beneficial impacts. I still see aspect registers that have nothing in there that's positive. Anybody out there that says we don't do anything that has a positive impact on the environment, I don't believe you. We all do things that will have some positive impact. Think about what that positive impact is, because that's also something that we need to grasp and make sure that it's got the maximum benefit. So it's not just about the negatives, is this? It's also about what are we doing that has a positive impact. It might be around the way we manage an area of the site. We might make it sort of be looking at increasing biodiversity in a corner of the site. We might have planted some wildflower seeds in a corner so that we can encourage a bit of biodiversity in a corner of the site. That's all a positive impact. Don't ignore it. Make sure it's in your aspects register. We need to communicate and document the methodology that's used. And we have to use a life cycle perspective. Now, one of the first questions we got when this new standard was published 7 years ago now was, on a life cycle perspective, how far upstream and how far downstream do we have to go? So if we're producing a product that might have, say, a 10-year life cycle, is it still our responsibility how that's been disposed of in 10 years' time? Or looking back up the stream, if we're let's say producing something out of sheet steel, do we have to consider where that iron ore was mined to produce the iron, to produce the steel, etc., etc.? Think back to what it says at the start of that slide. You only have to consider things that you can control or influence. The analogy I tend to use, it's a bit like when you're crossing a road. You look left, you look right, and then you cross the road. You make a judgment on what you can see. You don't know what's around the corner. You can't take that into account. So it's a little bit like that. You only need to take into account the things that you can control or influence. So you might be able to influence some of your suppliers. It may be that you can't influence the suppliers, in which case you don't have to take it into account. So it's thinking about what it is we can influence. Now, you might be able to influence how your product is disposed of in 10 years' time. Increasingly now, we're seeing people trying to design products that are easy to recycle. So that might be something that you would put in there as either a negative or maybe even as a positive. If you're working on helping your product be easily recyclable at the end of its life cycle, that's something that you can put into your aspects register. Legal requirements, compliance obligations, call them what you will. People still use the term legal and other requirements, and that's an acceptable term. So determine and have access to the relevant compliance obligations. Determine how they apply to the organisation and take into account within the EMS. So we're now talking about all of the various bits of legislation. Obviously, it varies, depends on where you are in the country. So it's certainly in the UK, Wales is different to England, which is different to Scotland, which is different to Northern Ireland. They all have slightly different requirements in some cases. I have clients that have sites in all three or four, should I say, of those different principalities, and they all have to have slightly different legal registers because of that. However, we need to determine if they're relevant to us and how they apply to us, and then make sure that our EMS has taken them into account in terms of how we manage our impacts on the environment and making sure that we are complying with our either legal and other requirements or the compliance obligations, be they mandatory or voluntary. And of course, compliance obligations can result in risk, which takes us back a little bit to the risks and opportunities section. The standard does allow for risk management, and you can, in certain circumstances, accept a risk of non-compliance, but you can't accept that risk of non-compliance from a legislation perspective. You cannot say it's cheaper to pay the fine than it is to actually put something into place. And this is one of the issues, and I apologise if there's anybody from this sector here, but one of the issues we've had a little bit in the UK at the moment are water companies who, under certain circumstances, are releasing raw sewage into the rivers, partly because it's actually cheaper to do that than it is to actually put something in place to prevent that happening. And they accept that they will be fined over it. And there's been some quite large fines, but it is one of the ongoing issues within the UK. And it causes me no end of difficulties if we're then assessing those organisations, because obviously they are taking, or they're accepting, the risk of non-compliance. Once we've identified what our significant aspects are, what our significant impacts on the environment are, what our compliance obligations are, and any other identified risks, we need to then decide what we're going to do about it. How are we going to plan to actually mitigate those risks? How are we going to make sure that we are doing what we're supposed to do or not doing what we're not supposed to do? We need to check the effectiveness of what it is that we're putting into place, taking into account consideration of the technological options that are available to us, financial and business requirements. And this section details with planning about how you're going to take action, not the actions itself. So that's just a little bit at the end of clause 6.1. That then feeds into the setting of our formal objectives. It's a policy commitment, and we no longer use the term target within 14,001. 14,001 talks about objectives and planning to achieve them. Incidentally, 50,001, I have a number of clients with a combined 14 and 50,001 system, that does use the term target, mainly because under energy management, the targets still are quantifiable numerical energy performance targets, whereas in 14,001, they are not necessarily quantifiable objectives in terms of setting a number. However, the objectives must be consistent with what you said in your policy. They must be measurable if practical. That's the point I've just made. They must be monitored, communicated, documented, and updated. And the plans that come out of that should detail who is going to be responsible, what are we going to do, when's it going to happen, what resources are required, how are we going to evaluate our achievement, are we going to set any indicators, and the planned action should then be integrated into our core business processes. That's quite a meaty clause. I've gone into a bit of detail there, and I know it's just after 11:45 here in the UK, and I do apologise slightly, but I wanted to emphasise that the planning bit is to me the important bit in the standard. Get that bit right, and everything that comes after that is going to move you in the right direction. So this clause on competency, I've skipped 7.1 because that's about provision of resources, and that to me comes under leadership. I wouldn't have put it under this section, but that's where it is. So competency, and it is about competency, not just training. So it's about organisations determining what competencies we need from our staff to enable them to carry out the jobs that we're expecting them to do. And we need to ensure that they're competent on the basis of education, training, or experience. Obviously, there are some areas where there are mandatory competencies. If you're going to be driving a 360-degree excavator, which is perhaps more health and safety than it will be environment, but that's a defined competency, and there is a licensing regime or requirement for that. But there are certain areas, waste management, certain waste management activities now need competent people, and those competencies are set. So we need to take action to allow staff to acquire the competencies if there's a shortfall, and to evaluate the success of those actions that we may have taken, which might be additional training, it might be mentoring, we might reassign staff if they maybe haven't got the competencies that require, or we may need to use additional staff to help them. However we do this, the competency records need to be maintained. So that's the required competencies. All too often I go in and ask about competencies, and I just see I'm just given a training matrix. It says this is the training everybody's had. That's the second part of the process. The first part is to define for the areas where there is a significant impact on the environment, to define the competencies required for staff working in those areas. People working under the organisation's control, and that includes contractors, need to be aware of a number of things, and you can see them listed there. So the business I was at down in Somerset a couple of days ago, in fact up to yesterday, one of the things we looked at as part of the audit, they had some contractors working on site, and I spent a short period of time in the audit looking at the contractors themselves, looking at the competencies of the contractor, looking at the inductions that they'd had when they came on site, to make sure that the contractors were aware of what was expected of them working on my client's site. And again, it lists there these are the things that everybody needs to be aware of. And if I've usually on an audit, if I find a weakness, quite often it's the contractor bit. So people coming onto your site and making sure that they fully understand that ultimately they're on your site, not necessarily working fully under your control, but any environmental issues they may cause, at the end of the day, they're on your site. So that you need to make sure that they take that into account. Communication, internally and externally, this comes back to the needs of interested parties. So the interested parties that we've talked about, be they internal, so maybe staff, managers, shareholders, whatever internally, will have communication requirements. People need to be aware of what's expected of them. People like to be aware of business, how the business is doing. People generally need to be aware of the objectives that have been set, how they can play their part, but also external communication, be it again customers, suppliers, regulators, neighbours, whoever. And as part of the needs of interested parties, that then moves us forward into this section on communication. And we need to establish a process on what, when, with whom and how we're going to communicate, and make sure that that communication takes place and is done in an effective manner. So just a little slide there that gives us an idea of the sorts of things. Quite often people tell me, and I got a bit of feedback from the last time around this, that found that these little slides are actually the more important bits from the presentation, the most useful bits, because what I've done is I've pulled out of the standard the things that the standard says you need to communicate on. So that's quite a good slide, a little checklist for yourselves to think about. Are we covering all of the things that we need to communicate about? The standard requires that we hold documented information. At one time, the standard used to talk about records and documents and forms and things like that. Everything now within all of the management systems is called documented information. And you need to be able to hold sufficient documentation to demonstrate a suitable, adequate and effective system. We're not looking for a complex document control system. Yes, documents need to be in the right place at the right time and the right issue, etc., etc. However, we're not looking for a really, really complex document control system. The documented information calls for the holding of documentation required by the standard, and the next slide is another of these slides that I've done all the work for you, and I'll explain that in a minute. We don't have to have a manual, so the requirements for having an environmental manual or a quality manual or health and safety manual really are long gone. People still choose to have them, but you don't have to. But whatever form the documentation is, it has to be controlled, available and protected so that it can be lost or can be recovered if there's any issues. The sad person that I am, once upon a time I went through this new standard and wrote down every time that the standard says documented information must be retained. And what you've got there, I know I've just said that we don't talk about documents and records anymore, but I've used it purposely here because I think we understand better the difference between a document and a record. So a document tends to provide some sort of information, whereas a record, as the name suggests, records something. It records the results of something. So if you can use that and go through and say, we hold documented information on everything that's on there, and by documented, it could be either a hard copy or a soft copy, a computer held copy, you won't go far wrong if you can cover everything that's on there. And then there's a little bit of a safety net at the bottom that says, plus any documented information deemed necessary, including those of external origin. So for instance, there might be documents that are required of you from, say, the Environment Agency in England or SEPA in Scotland. There might be some other bits of documentation, maybe related to permits or whatever else, that's deemed necessary within the compliance obligations that you've got. Right, we're on the home straight. Operational planning and control. We now need to start to put into place the things that we said we were going to do in clause 6. So where we talked about planning to achieve our objectives, to reduce the negative impacts of what we're doing, to increase the positive impacts, we now need to start to make sure that that's in place, to make sure we've got processes to control what we're expecting, and to make sure that we implement ultimately the planned actions from clauses 6.1 and 6.2, which were aspects and the risks and opportunities. So we're talking about planning to make sure. Sorry, Claire, I understand you've got to go. If you want to watch later, you can come back to the presentation. Process. We need to make sure that the processes include controlling our significant aspects, our compliance obligations, the objectives that we've identified, and also any other risks and opportunities that we think are important. But also to make sure that we are controlling outsourced processes and have some degree of control or influence over outsourced processes. And an outsourced process isn't a subcontractor that maybe down the road that's doing some work. You know, so let's say we're producing components and we send them out to a company to electroplate them. That isn't an outsourced process. An example of an outsourced process that's real for me would be a client of mine who has a large amount of warehousing. They have so many forklift trucks that the forklift truck supplier has a full-time engineer on my client's site. They have an area of the site that's their own little compound in the corner, and they spend their time servicing, maintaining the 60 or 70 forklift trucks that the company operate. That engineer still works for the forklift truck supplier, but they're operating full-time on my client's site. They're holding oils, they're holding lubricants, they're producing waste. All of that is an outsourced process that needs to be controlled within our own EMS. We need to make sure that we take into account life cycle perspective in terms of this operational planning. So we need to make sure that we're establishing controls in design and development. So are we designing in environmental requirements pertinent to life cycle? So if we are developing new products, are we making them easily recyclable? Or are we using composite materials that we can't do anything with? We need to think about now environmental requirements for procurement. I still get people that say, right, I'd like to look through your purchasing and procurement process now. And they look at me as though I'm funny because they think that that's only related to quality. But we start to now want to ask questions about how are you evaluating the environmental impact of the materials, the suppliers that you're using. It's not just a quality process now. We need to think about this from an environmental perspective in terms of purchasing. We need to think about how we're going to monitor and measure the results of what we're doing. We need to make sure we've got the right level of documentation. Do we need to provide guidance? Do we need to provide procedures or work instructions? And also to make sure that we consider the potential impact and providing information, thinking about the transport, delivery, use, and end-of-life treatment. And the reason there's a little bit in there about external providers is this is how we might get customer compliance obligations. So the company I was at in Somerset yesterday, they provide potatoes to a very, very large, well-known household supermarket. The type of packaging that they use is determined by the supermarket. So that then becomes a compliance obligation. They're told the type of packaging and the amount of packaging, and it has to be returnable, that they use. So therefore, that is included within their compliance obligations. I appreciate it's 12 o'clock. If anybody needs to go, feel free. You won't miss anything because you will see the slides, you will get a link to the slides, and you will also get a link to a recording of this whole webinar, which will obviously continue to record. So I appreciate if some of you do need to go, and I notice the numbers have dropped by a few. So, as I say, I apologise, but it's just the nature of how I tend to deliver presentations. If anybody's got any questions, I'll put a call in now to say if anybody wants to add any questions in as we go along, feel free, and we will cover them. Emergency preparedness response. So we talked about right at the start potential situations, potential emergency situations that might occur. It might be spillage, it might be fire, it might be whatever. It could be something that can happen on site. We need to think about how we're going to respond, how we're going to prevent it happening in the first place, and if it does, how we're going to mitigate it. We need to be able to respond to actual emergency situations, make sure that we can mitigate and respond as appropriate, and then if something does happen, to review what's happened, and then also to then maybe reevaluate our response, reevaluate our instructions, reevaluate the training and competency if there was an issue, and then provide whatever information is needed. I'll skip through these pretty quickly because, as I say, it is 1 minute past 12 now. We do need to monitor, measure and analyse our environmental performance. We need to think about what we're going to monitor, how we're going to monitor it, what methods are we going to use. Do we have to have calibrated equipment? So if we're monitoring the pH of our effluent, do we have to have calibrated equipment there? If we're going to be monitoring the makeup of our what we put up the chimney, do we also have to have that sort of calibrated? What criteria are we going to use? What appropriate indicators? In 14,001, the use of indicators is optional. In 50,001, it's mandatory. So an indicator might be kilowatt hours of energy per unit of production, or kilowatt hours of energy per percent of turnover, something like that. So we might think about, do we need some indicators? How are we going to monitor? Who's going to do the monitoring? How are we going to evaluate? And how are we going to communicate? But interestingly, the bit that a lot of people miss here is evaluating the performance of the EMS itself. Now that's done during the internal audit process, but we are looking to make sure one of the requirements, one of the policy commitments is that we will continually improve the management system itself. And that's one thing that we as assessors look for. Within this clause is also evaluating our compliance with those compliance obligations. It can be done as part of an internal audit process. It can be done through a review of documentation. It can be done through a site tour. I have clients, some of which I think are on the call today, who would do site audits. So maybe when they've set up a site, a new construction site or something along those lines, there would be a site audit to make sure that everything's in place as should be. That's still an evaluation of compliance. It's evaluating compliance with your own standards, but also compliance with any legal areas as well. How fuel is being stored, is fuel, is the necessary spill kit material in place, etc., etc. We need to think about who's suitable to do that. Other organisations I work with, in fact, the organisation I was with again yesterday, they use a third party to come in once a year and carry out an overall legal compliance audit, but they still do their own site tours and routine day-to-day monitoring. It's expected that you maintain knowledge of your compliance status. So if I come in as an assessor and say, are you complying with, or show me how you're complying with this piece of legislation, I would expect you to be able to tell me and show me. So a good example again from yesterday, I asked them all about the packaging compliance regulations and asked them to explain how they meet those. And yes, they were able to demonstrate what was required and demonstrate their compliance because they'd retained the right records. Interestingly, a non-compliance isn't elevated to a non-conformance if identified and corrected within the scope of the EMS. So if I come in, for instance, and find an area of non-compliance, but you've already identified it within your EMS and can demonstrate that you are handling it correctly and you are putting into place corrective action, I wouldn't raise that as a non-conformance, because to me, that's demonstrating that your system is working. And remember, this evaluation applies to all voluntary and mandatory compliance obligations. Internal audit, I think, is fairly straightforward. You are required to conduct internal audits to verify conformance to the standard and to your own EMS requirements. We need to set an audit program, consider how we're going to do the audit. One of the things the standard not requires, but is strongly encouraging, is that we move more towards process auditing. Now, process auditing works very well if you've got a fully integrated system, maybe looking at 9, 14 and 45. So you would take a process, be it a manufacturing process or whatever it might be, and you would audit that process in its entirety. So you would look at maybe a manufacturing process and you would say, how are we managing it from a quality perspective? How are we managing it environmentally? And also, how are we managing it in a safe health and safety manner? And you could look at that process in its entirety, looking at all the different aspects and inputs into and the outputs from that process. The standard requires that a management review is held. A management review, I maintain, is we take a step back and we look at how the system and how our organisation is operating. And it's a top management review of the standard, of the system, and how are we operating. And I've just, again, lifted out from the standard the things that should be input into the management review. These are all of the things that you're expected to look at, to have a view on, to decide whether everything's happening as it should. Are we doing as well as we should? Can we do better? What do we need to improve? And then the outputs, when I would then say, right, can I have a look at your management review? We look for a number of things. The one that everybody, not everybody, the one that a lot of people miss is the first bullet point on the right-hand side. I like to see, and it's a requirement of the standard, at the end of the management review, almost as a summary, right at the end, a conclusion by the company's senior management on the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the management system. That is a requirement, and quite often that is missing. So that's a little tip there. I would like to see as a summary at the end that is a statement. Finally, continual improvement. So the standard requires that we determine opportunities for improvement and make sure we implement actions to achieve those intended outcomes. So it's improving the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the system itself. What are we going to do? How are we going to do that? And then improving our environmental performance, which again, you've seen the achievement of intended outcomes, adverse environmental impacts, and increasing beneficial impacts. Part of that is looking at how we deal with things when they go wrong. If we raise non-conformities, if we have issues, how do we deal with them? What do we do? And again, what we're saying is, what the standard is saying is that the type of response that we put into place needs to be graded, if you like, suitable to the magnitude of what's gone wrong. So we don't spend days and days on something that's fairly minor, nor do we just pay a cursory glance or pay a little scant attention to something that's really causing problems. And it requires that we document what's gone wrong, what's the non-conformity, what's the action that we've taken, and what are the results of those actions. And then finally, there you can see the requirements that we would look for when we carry out the audit. Last slide, almost. One of the things, and I would have maybe spent a little bit longer on this, however, one of the things that I'm trying to encourage, it's a little bit of a sales pitch here, I always encourage my clients also to think about, is 14,001 certification the end of the road? Or is it the first step on a much longer journey? So you might say, well, what comes next? So you might think about energy management. So what energy management does is it takes what you're doing within your 14,001 system on energy and raises it to a higher level. A lot of people use 50,001 as an answer to the compliance with ESOS, which is the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme. If you're a large business, you have a compliance obligation every 4 years, and a lot of our clients use 50,001 as an answer. If you've got 50,001, then you do not have to do anything else under the ESOS regulations. The other area where there's a huge amount of growth and interest at the moment is in carbon neutrality. And again, businesses use 50,000, so businesses use 14,001 as a way of drawing together not just their environmental impacts now. And the company, again, that I know I keep referring back to them, I'm not going to say who they are, but the company I've just spent 2 days at down in Somerset, they use their 14,001 system not just to manage their environmental impacts, but as a mechanism for pulling together all of the different sustainability issues within the business. So a lot of the innovations, a lot of the work they're doing with farmers in terms of types of crop selection, looking at waste management, how that they can use all of the different potatoes. I think the total amount of potatoes that are actually not used is less than 2%. And there are various ways that they've come up with through innovation in terms of alternative uses. So if a potato can't be put in a plastic bag and sold in a supermarket, what else can we use it for? And they've used the waste hierarchy as a driver to look at the various ways, and they've got, I think it's less than 2% of the incoming potatoes that don't find their way into the food chain in one way or another. So they're using 14,001 as a much broader tool to manage their sustainability, and that is a direction I would encourage you to take. Okay, do NQA provide verification to pass 2080? Not at the moment, Sean. It's something, there's a number of things. At the moment, we do pass 2060. We are now looking in some depth at some of the other relevant standards on carbon. I would, so at the moment I have to say no, we don't, but it's something that we are considering along with a number of other things. I think that's about it really. Just the other thing, this has happened now, but in the email that you'll get probably early next week now, which will point out to you the give you copies of the slides, give you links to the recording of this webinar. There is a webinar that was run a couple of months ago now, but again, there's a recording available and there will be a link to this. It was a webinar that we carried out that showed you how the three standards, PAS 2060, 14,001 and 50,001, work together in unison. And it would be well worth taking some time out. As I say, it's a recording of the webinar, but we've had a lot of very, very positive feedback on how that runs. Whether we'll run it again or not, I'm not so sure. But there will be a link, and I would sort of strongly suggest that if you're interested in moving on a little bit further, you think about that. I need to draw a line under that. We've now overrun by 13, 14 minutes. Thanks for those that have stopped with me all the way through. If you want to get in touch at any time, my email address, I don't think it's actually on any of the slides, but we can, again, there's a little bit of a sales pitch there for another sort of training that we're offering in terms of understanding and achieving carbon neutrality. That's something else that we're looking at. We've talked about question and answers, and as I say thank you. Right, thank you everybody. Yeah, you'll get a copy of the slides. My email address isn't on there, but it's richard.walsh, that's W-A-L-S-H, so richard.walsh @nqa.com. and I'm happy to engage with any of you at any time on any of this. Now, obviously, at the end of the day, if you are clients of ours, we can't act as consultants, but I'm happy to go as far as I'm allowed in offering interpretation or help on any particular areas that you might have. So thank you again. Thank you for sticking with me going over. It's just about lunchtime here now for us, and I'll hopefully catch up with you again. If you're bored this afternoon, my fellow principal assessor, Terry Fisher, Terry and I are doing another webinar this afternoon starting at 2 o'clock on the benefits of integrating standards. So if you've nothing else to do this afternoon, then you could join us. Some of you may already be, I don't know. Great, thanks everybody, and hope you found that useful, and keep in touch, and have a good rest of the day if I don't speak to you again. Okay, thanks a lot, and see you again sometime. Bye-bye.